Hello, everybody, and welcome to our little chat today about soft skills and the entrepreneurial tool belt. My name is Michael, and I'm going to be representing Peterborough and the Kawarthas Business Advisory Center. We're also known as the BAC for short, but we are your regional source for assistance if you're looking to start up a business or if you have an existing company and want to take it to the next level. All of our services are completely complimentary and confidential. Currently working at the BAC, we have Hilary Mannion, Entrepreneurship Officer, and myself, Michael Tamani, Virtual Services Advisor. So I started this role in November 2020, and it really centers around trying to assist businesses that are suffering from COVID. But if you're a business that's in the idea stage and you're looking to finalize your concept or write a business plan, I can definitely help you out with that as well. So now that we have all of the introductions out of the way, let's talk about why we're here. So I've outlined 4 objectives that I hope that we'll be able to meet by the end of our time here today. 1, we want to differentiate between what is a hard skill and what is a soft skill. Number 2, identify types of soft skills, and that's easier said than done because it's kind of a subjective topic. Number 3, understand the importance of soft skills. And last but not least, we want to be able to create goals for our self-improvement. This right here is a graphic generated by Indeed.com. Now, I'm sure most people have either heard of the website or even used it, but what's most interesting about this is that it's basically taken all the data from the job postings and created a list of all the in-demand hard skills and soft skills. Hard skills represent your technical knowledge, training, and education that you've accumulated over the years. They're very easy to prove or disprove. For example, if you list on your resume that you can speak both French and English, well, that's something that can be easily tested. You may have also noticed that the hard skills listed on this graphic are very computer-based and job-specific. But on the opposite side of things, we have soft skills, which are broad and hard to define. Now that's why most people are going to be lying about them on their resume. Anybody can claim that they have integrity or are dependable, but how do we know whether that's true or not? Well, the reality of life is that we won't actually know until we establish a relationship with somebody over a longer period of time. There's no way that you can actively determine whether somebody is going to be dependable through an interview process. In most cases, it's going to take months or even years to truly learn if somebody's soft skills are legit or not. If we're looking at the argument of whether soft skills or hard skills are more important, well, the answer is probably both equally. Now, if we take an example of, say, a coffee shop, they could have really good coffee, but if the customer service skills aren't there, that business is likely not going to prosper. The same thing is going to happen if you reverse these as well. Bad coffee, great customer service, that's not exactly a recipe for success. That's why it's always great to look at your hard skills in conjunction with your soft skills. If we're looking at things from an entrepreneurial lens, these are the 5 categories that come to mind for me first if we're talking about overall significance. And from these 5 categories, we'll probably actually be indirectly talking about maybe even 50 plus soft skills. So it really comes down to subjectivity and how people interpret what soft skills truly are. Communication is usually the first soft skill that comes to mind for most people. Now the reason for that being is because it's the easiest to understand and we're always talking and writing emails. It's ever present. A lot of the elements of communication can be quite technical, but what we have to do is we have to understand how some of these elements create a perception of who we are as entrepreneurs and try and cater that to our audience. Before I talk about how individuals communicate, I think it really helps to understand how we fit into the big picture of running a business with multiple people involved. As companies grow, it becomes increasingly difficult to control communication. Internal communication centers around managing the interactions between employees, partners, and ownership. Not only does this refer to the basics like speaking and writing, but also accountability. A well-run organization has clearly defined processes that employees can refer to. For example, the scope of employees' work, or standard operating procedures for routine tasks. Entrepreneurs are absolute control freaks. Now, this really isn't all too much of an issue operating as an individual, but the second that you introduce employees into the mix, having that ambiguity can lead to a lot of conflict. Now, about 12% of startup failures can be attributed to this, having a breakdown in internal communication and not having your processes run efficiently. External communication is where individualism starts to come into play and refers to customer relations. Perception is often the key here, with first impressions being make or break for many small businesses. Since entrepreneurs are often synonymous with their company, This means your first impression will also be the first impression of your business. Making a good first impression comes down to 7 key points. The first one we're going to talk about today is self-awareness. Knowing yourself and understanding what you're capable of doing is often the key to success. You can often fix issues related to forming an impression before they're even made. For example, if you know that you're not the best public speaker, you have the ability to practice beforehand. Number 2, we have empathy. Putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and understanding how they feel can work wonders. How you communicate with somebody who's happy versus sad is very different. And having that cookie cutter approach to doing business is not necessarily the key to success. You want to customize things. Number 3, confidence. Confidence is especially important for pitching, interviews, selling to customers. For example, how can an investor be confident in you if you're not confident in yourself? Practice can often make you look confident on the outside. Maybe you're not feeling the most confident on the inside, but people don't necessarily have to know that. Number 4 is commonality and represents your ability to establish instant rapport with somebody. For example, if you see somebody's wearing a Jays jersey or Maple Leafs jersey, they have a pet with them, children, you can establish an instant connection. If we're talking about Zoom, look at the pictures in the background or some books, and this will give you some good insight into what they're interested in. Strike up a little bit of a conversation before your meeting and see if you can establish that little bit of a relationship boost based off of having a common interest. Number 5, listening. Your ability to listen demonstrates interest. Especially if you're involved in a longer conversation, things can loop back around, and if you forgot important details, that can reflect poorly on you as well as your business. These last 2 points are probably the least important that they've ever been, but we still have to acknowledge them. Personal image should correlate and align with the brand that you want to convey for your business. And last but not least, politeness. Common sense prevails here. Don't interrupt others when they're speaking and avoid those sensitive topics. Now that we understand how to make a good first impression, let's take it a step further and talk about an actual scenario, such as a pitch. So in this situation, certain things that make up your impression are more important. For example, confidence and self-awareness are probably the most important when it comes to making a good presentation. If we take a look at this pie chart right here, you'll see that 90% of success is attributed towards tone of voice and facial expression. Now you can also think of this as being confident, because the most confident people have great tone of voice and great expression. So if we look at the remaining 10%, you'll see wording is at 7. And most people would think, why isn't this more important? Well, the answer is that subconsciously that's how people are forming an impression of you. And in most cases, what you say in terms of words doesn't necessarily have that big impact like you'd expect. So if we think back to university, college, or high school, think about the best presenters that you can remember. Were they actually saying things that had great substance to them? In my experience, absolutely not. The best presenters who got the best grades, they are the ones that were often spurting nonsense. But the thing is, people were actually more enthused with listening to them because they had great tone of voice and great facial expression. Just because wording is at 7% doesn't make it insignificant. We still have to make sure that we're simple and to the point. At the end of the day, the purpose of having a presentation is that you want the audience to go and look at your business plan once you're done. So the wording should also align with what you have in your documentation. Last but not least, you probably are curious what this 3% is all about. It's bias. So if somebody doesn't like the look of you, or they don't like the industry that you're in, you're probably not going to convince them otherwise to potentially invest in you. So what helps here is to focus on the remaining 97% that you can control. Now that we've gone over an example of how to make a good first impression in person, let's talk about how we can adapt some of those same principles to the digital environment. First, let's take a look at email. And what's interesting here is that we're taking away that person-to-person element. So that facial expression is not going to apply here. So what takes more importance now is your tone and your wording. And remember to always be polite. You don't know how much volume the other person is dealing with, or potentially even the hours that they work. Follow up after not receiving a response after a couple days, not a couple hours. If your request is urgent, there are different channels of communication available. You should probably get on the phone instead of waiting for somebody to email you back. Last but not least, make it easy for the recipient, especially if you have multiple requests or are asking for a meeting. Limit the back and forth by formatting a list or by being proactive and forwarding your availability. Instant messaging or texting pertains mostly to internal communication, but there are certain instances where you may be texting with a potential customer or client. You want to keep it light. Each message should not read like an email. On the flip side, you don't want to spam people either with irrelevant information. Video conferencing is probably the one that people are most interested in right now because it's the new norm for online meetings. In many ways, Zooming from a home office is more personable than actually meeting in person. Why? Because you're providing a little bit of a window into your life. Right behind you, if your background is clean or totally devoid of personality, then that's going to reflect on you as a person. This again is where the soft skill of commonality comes into play. People can establish instant rapport by easily identifying common interests. It always helps to know your audience, but it's generally not the end of the world if you have some things in the background or if a pet comes across the screen. You just want to make sure that their appearance is brief and doesn't turn into a major distraction. In my experience using Zoom for small group meetings, I would say the first 2 to 5 minutes is usually reserved for casual talk. Now, if we were to talk about the weather or current events, that's not necessarily going to leave a lasting impression. So if you can go beyond that to connect with people on more of a personal level, that can definitely benefit you down the line. Last but not least, we have to talk about phoning people. Now, you can probably also tie in talking to somebody over the computer, but not necessarily seeing their face. This is significant because facial expression is so important. But when we take that away, basically our tone is going to account for all of our success. So making sure that we sound as friendly as possible is going to be the key to success. Like I mentioned before, phoning somebody usually signals a little bit more urgency than an email. So if somebody takes the effort to call you or leave a voicemail, you want to try and return that as soon as you possibly can. And remember that if something is urgent, that person may be upset or angry. So you want to try and be as empathetic as possible and remember to keep your tone of voice in check. Now let's move on to creativity. Now this one is very interesting to me because when people first hear the word creativity, their thought is usually an artist. However, everybody has their own creative side, especially entrepreneurs. They're usually the most successful when they get to be creative. The process itself is very individualistic and subjective. And if you ask a lot of artists, they'll usually say that their best work is done in isolation or by themselves. You can also think of this how bands often break up because of creative differences. It's individuals clashing over the creative process. Creativity has become so important in modern business that an entire approach was named after it, and it's taken center stage in entrepreneurship. People are starting with small ideas and what they have on hand. This approach has been made possible through the internet, where entrepreneurs are creating businesses with extremely low overhead costs. Progress is incremental, where experimentation takes priority over pure optimization. Now, what I mean by that is that people are getting creative, and they're not necessarily emphasizing the bottom line or profit margins. They want to play around and see what works best for them and their business. When you combine all these factors on the right-hand side, entrepreneurs overall are facing a little bit less risk. Because the risk factor overall is lower, we're seeing more businesses than ever before. Now, this means more competition, but that doesn't necessarily mean directly competing. The new age approach is that you want to collaborate as much as possible and adapt. The creation approach doesn't have as much financial risk involved. So if we take a look at how people react to, say, starting up a business and it's not immediately successful, those ideas usually get dropped pretty quick. So in these instances, they are classified as failures, but they're also learning experiences. If you can learn something by creating a business and potentially use that to create something new down the line, something that's more resilient, that is a great thing. On the opposite side of things, the prediction approach has so much risk involved that people have to avoid failure at all costs, sometimes when things are not even feasible in the first place. There are 4 factors at work within the creative process, and because everybody has their own unique personality, the balance of these 4 processes is going to be a little bit different from person to person. We can think of creativity as a blank canvas and the 4 practices as an art style. Each person is going to create a different painting from one another. So let's go over the 4 processes individually. Creation is the act of developing something brand new. It's easier said than done to create something that's never been seen or done before. Now, this isn't what many businesses are doing today. In modern business, experimentation is the way that most entrepreneurs are forming their new venture. They're taking an existing product or service and improving it drastically by making simple changes. Moving on to the right-hand side, we have play. Children are known for their playful and crazy ideas. This is the type of mindset that modern businesses are looking to try and capture. If we think about Google, they had such a unique setup going that some people weren't leaving work for weeks on end. They are taking it to extreme levels because they were so inspired by what they were doing. This may be an extreme example, but if you can be imaginative at work and have fun, that's always a great thing. But at the end of the day, if you're an entrepreneur, you're naturally going to be going through those highs and lows, the peaks and valleys. But when the moments are good, try to have as much fun as possible. Last but not least, we have empathy, and we've already talked about this a couple times before. It's your ability to place yourself in someone else's shoes and experiencing what their problems are from their perspective. And if you can understand their problems, you're already on the first step to forming a solution. If we take a look at the creative process as a whole, the right-hand side is how you go about recognizing opportunities, and the left is how you go about solving them. The great thing with the creative process is that from start to finish, we can all arrive at vastly different ideas. But how do we know if our idea is any good or not? This is where the soft skill of problem solving starts to come into effect. Now, what we want to accomplish here is we want to get some tangible evidence that our idea is going to work. How we accomplish this is through research and involving as many people as we possibly can. And by gaining this evidence, we can communicate this to potential stakeholders in the business. Because entrepreneurs are so emotionally invested in their ideas, the process of validating them doesn't necessarily come naturally, so it's something that you should always be thinking about no matter what you're doing. This right here is a very simple problem-solving framework that has been around for ages. Now you probably already think this looks really familiar, and the reason is we've already talked about steps 1 and 2 because they're mainly covered through the process of being creative. Most of the time, step 3 is automatically assumed by entrepreneurs. Because you have a solution, it automatically means there's going to be a benefit. That's simply not the case. Because your solution is going to have to be paid for, sometimes that expenditure overrides the solution, so you have to be quite mindful of that. Showing the benefit is so overlooked by entrepreneurs. If we were to look at the reasons why startups fail, about 40% can be attributed to a lack of feasibility. Now this can come in many different forms, but probably the most common are technical feasibility and financial feasibility. And by technical feasibility, we mean maybe you have an invention and it just doesn't quite work. And number 2, a lack of financial feasibility means that your costs are too high and the prices that you are charging just aren't going to work with the customers. So how do we make sure that our business is going to be feasible before committing a lot of time and effort into it? Well, the answer is this framework on the right-hand side here. Now, this is something that scientists actually use on a daily basis to experiment. This can also be used to create and refine a business process. Now, most entrepreneurs are going to be great at steps 1 through 3. So they have their potential problem, they've gone on Google to do some secondary research, and then have formulated their solution. And that's where the process ends. But that is a gigantic mistake. We have to take things a step further and conduct some tests. Now, how this is done is through primary research, or in other words, talking with your customers. This can come in the form of a survey or structured interviews. Whatever the best tool for the job is, the idea here is to gain as much insight as you possibly can about your potential business. And it's interesting from the perspective of a business advisor, how many people go through this process and then realize their business idea was not feasible. People with a constructive mindset are able to go through this process and learn, go all the way back up to that solution stage, refine it, and then conduct more tests. And each time they go through the process, they refine their business bit by bit, and eventually they have something that's completely feasible and successful. Now, we also have others that go through the process and realize, well, this business was never going to be successful in the first place. These people ultimately benefit as well because they're not investing tens of thousands of dollars of their own money or years of their time into a project that was never going to work in the first place. We also have to acknowledge that the average stakeholder is not capable of visualizing your business. Now, we have to communicate with them in a way that they can understand, and most of the time that is financially. So if we can demonstrate that the business is feasible and that it's low risk, you're more likely to get that investment or loan that you need to be successful. Because so many entrepreneurs skip over the research phase, This can be another good way to set yourself apart from the pack and increasing your overall perception. Somebody that presents thorough research is more likely to be seen as hardworking or have a high level of attention to detail, and these are traits that people want to invest in. Now that you've created a business concept and proved that it can be feasible, the next step is supporting it over the long run, and that is where adaptability comes into play. And you may have heard other ways that people describe adaptability, such as never settling for the status quo or being dynamic. They really all come down to the same thing. Adaptability is so important to entrepreneurship because all businesses go through a pretty similar life cycle until a certain point, and that is maturity. The most adaptable businesses are able to extend their life cycle by pivoting. On the opposite side of things, businesses that stagnate are the ones that decline and eventually go bankrupt. When we're talking about the business life cycle, it does occur over years, so it is easier said than done to be adaptable. Where entrepreneurs often get trapped is during the launch and growth phases. Because it's so exciting and you're experiencing booming sales, you often get infatuated with your processes. And then eventually, when you do start to reach maturity, you may have developed some bad habits that are difficult to get out of. When you do get to the point of maturity, it really does help to take a few steps back and really look at why your business was successful in the first place. This is actually a real-life business case that was brought to some of my students not too long ago, and it was interesting working through and finding the root cause, because on the surface, this business appeared to be very successful. So I got my students to use the 5 whys method of understanding root cause issues. You start with your initial problem and then ask yourself, why is this happening? And from that answer, you then ask why again. You repeat this until you eventually find the root cause. Most of the time, it's going to be around 5. If your problem is less complex, you may be able to get away with 3 or 4 whys. So let's go ahead and look at my example right here. Despite rave reviews online, my bakery is slowly losing business. So why is this happening? I got my students to go out and do a little bit of research, and they found that daily traffic was decreasing, and not only that, people were buying less per order. So why is this happening? The average customer is coming to the bakery a handful of times and that's it. So why is that happening? Well, these people are looking for fresh social media content, and they don't necessarily want to order the same thing twice. Why is this happening? Well, the menu is not changing consistently enough to satisfy these people that want to take pictures of their food. And why? Well, there's no schedule or plan to create limited time specialty items, and that is the root cause of the issue. This example that I provided is a classic case of how an entrepreneur fell into a false sense of security. It was a great thing that this person came to my students for help because they were able to set her back on the right path, and she's doing better than ever. All it took was a little bit of planning and scheduling to make sure that these customers were coming back repeatedly to try out all these specialty items that were only going to be around for a limited time. People often associate adaptability with surviving and being by yourself, but that's simply not the case. Often the first step to being adaptable is asking other people for help and their opinions. This is where the growth mindset starts to come into effect, and this graphic here lists a lot of the key characteristics. It also does a good job of summarizing the key findings of some studies conducted over the years. And my favorite is about a study of grade school children. Half of the students who received an A on their tests were told that they tried hard, whereas the other half were praised as simply being smart. The first group maintained high grades, while the latter dropped considerably. On average, the root cause of success was studying and not natural intelligence. Doesn't this sound awfully familiar to the bakery we were just talking about? The owner was receiving tremendous feedback about the quality of her food, but the root cause was entirely different. It was about being trendy. And sure, having great food was an important factor of success, but it wasn't essentially the key factor. While this entrepreneur may have fallen into the fixed mindset temporarily, she was able to correct her behavior and extend the bakery's life cycle. With that being said, the growth mindset and the fixed mindset are not set in stone. They evolve over time depending on your experiences, and you may have a growth mindset today or a fixed mindset today, and it can be totally different a year down the line. The last category of soft skills we are going to be talking about today is work ethic. I think this one is really interesting because entrepreneurs are often praised for their tremendous work ethic. However, I consider it to be kind of a double-edged sword, mainly arising from a misconception where people equate work ethic to simply working long hours, which I don't think is true. I believe that quantity must achieve balance with quality. You've probably heard the saying, work smarter, not harder. This is what you want to achieve if you want to be successful over a long period of time. Work ethic is more about how people perceive you. In reality, business stakeholders have no clue how many hours a week you devote to being an entrepreneur. You want to develop the image of being a hard worker, but not necessarily working yourself to the bone in the process. The first thing that we have to talk about in forming that good perception is time management, which defines your ability to work efficiently. If two workers perform the exact same job, one finishes in 40 hours and the other in 60, the worker who took 40 hours to complete the job has a higher overall perception of work ethic. If both jobs were completed at the same level of quality, the person who finishes in 40 hours is delivering a lot more value for their time. And that is really the most important measure that we have to hone in on. Next up, we have consistency, and this is all about reducing long-term variation and pacing yourself. For example, students who cram before exams don't perform as well as those who study in smaller amounts every week. Another good example are people who work themselves to the bone and eventually get sick or hurt, and this takes them out of commission. When you're out of sight, you're also out of mind, and this doesn't work wonders for perception. Last but certainly not least, emotional intelligence has kind of become a buzzword as of late. It encompasses self-awareness, self-control, and achievement orientation. Like I mentioned during communication, self-awareness is your ability to know yourself and what you're capable of doing. Entrepreneurs often run into trouble by performing tasks outside their area of expertise. Sometimes it's best to seek professional help. A common example here are people trying to do their own accounting. Self-control, or the ability to manage yourself emotionally, is more important than what people believe. Entrepreneurs experience the emotional roller coaster of operating a business, which inevitably has its lows. These points can often crush individuals who don't manage their stress very well. Conversely, success can lull entrepreneurs into a false sense of security. Complacency can spell disaster, especially for businesses operating in competitive markets. Next up, we're going to discuss achievement orientation on the next slide. Achievement orientation is the motivation factor for entrepreneurs, who in many cases are going to be acting as their own boss for the very first time. In these situations, self-control is going to play a huge factor in monitoring your behavior. This is where you want to develop a system of goals and rewards that's unique to your personality. The carrot and stick metaphor applies here because you want to reward yourself when you do something good and punish yourself if maybe you don't hit a deadline. You may also want to try and extend this mentality towards your customers, especially if you want to promote certain kinds of behavior and discourage others. For example, if somebody leaves you a great review online, you may want to give them a 20% off coupon for their next purchase. This is going to try and encourage not only this person to come back to your business, but maybe they're going to talk to their friends and say, well, if you leave a good review for this person online, you'll also get a discount. Businesses will also try to stimulate demand for times when they're really not all that busy. This again comes back to influencing behavior by offering additional rewards in most cases. For example, if restaurants aren't overall that busy on Tuesday and Wednesday nights, that's generally when you see promotions, and it encourages people to come out on days where they kind of just want to stay home. These types of strategies definitely mesh well with your achievement orientation, but they can also work wonders for your time management and consistency. Now that we've gone and identified some basic categories of soft skills, it's time to talk about self-improvement. And the best way to go about doing that is just picking a skill and practicing. If you want to take it a step further, you can also identify somebody you admire and learn from them. Number 3 is probably my favorite here on the list because it can have an instant effect on your soft skills. For example, if you recognize that maybe you're not the best writer, why not go ahead and pay for a program like Grammarly that will look at all your writing and make sure that you are providing that great first impression on your emails. Another example is if you want to prepare for a speech, record yourself, listen to yourself over and over and over again, and see if you can find out ways to potentially improve from that. And also, this is a good way to try and benchmark yourself. Keep that first recording that you ever did for your speech and listen to it after you're done practicing. In most cases, you are going to see a drastic improvement between your first recording and the end result. Sometimes, this can be the confidence boost that you need to take it even a step further. Self-improvement should always be accompanied by goal setting. And this right here is a simple framework to make sure that your goals are going in the right direction. SMART is essentially an acronym meaning specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. All goals should be specific, meaning that it's not too broad and that you can easily identify what you want to achieve. Measurable should have some clear type of definition of how you want to succeed. This kind of goes back to problem solving because you want something that is going to actually prove that you made progress. For example, if we're talking about preparing for a speech, if you have that first recording and can compare it to the end result, you have something that is measurable. Attainable means that your goals should be realistic. In my opinion, it helps to set pretty easy goals because what's stopping you from achieving them and then setting more down the line? And this speaks to the mentality of working at things incrementally. So you're going to have your overall grand vision. How are you going to get there step by step by setting little goals? Relevancy is all about making things worthwhile. For example, if you're going to be investing a lot of time into becoming a better public speaker, are you actually going to get a return off of this investment? If you think about that, it's usually a good way to make sure that you're prioritizing the right goals. Last but not least, we have time-bound, meaning that every goal should have some form of target date. And just like I said about attainability, it helps to really have goals that work away at your overall vision step by step. Because our goals aren't going to be too large in scale, it makes sense to have time-bound objectives that resemble that scope. For example, 2 weeks to a month should be appropriate for most goals. And if you are ahead of schedule and finish before your target date, that's a great thing. You should set another goal and try and build upon the last. Now that we've reached the end of our presentation here today, I want to thank you very much for either watching or listening. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My name is Michael Tamani, and I am the Virtual Service Advisor at the Business Advisory Center. Feel free to follow us on social media, and if you do require any more information on what we're all about, please visit us at peterboroughed.ca. Thank you again.